with governmental officials, also with the UN agencies in the Philippines. And she also has done some meeting with many NGOs relevant in the area. She has traveled to the two places here in the Philippines, the Zamboanga city and the Cebu, where she met representatives of the civil society, where she also met with many of the organizations supporting from government, from the civil society, and also victims of trafficking. And now we have her with us. She's just finishing her interim report. And the idea is that she will present you some of her findings, also some relevant considerations regarding the work ahead, and also appreciation on the work that has been implemented in the Philippines. So without further ado, I will transfer to our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Resident Coordinator of the United Nations here in the Philippines, distinguished ladies and gentlemen of the media. I want to just share with you my preliminary finding. Following an invitation by the government of the Philippines, I conducted an official visit from 5th to 9th of November 2012 to examine the situation of trafficked persons and the impact of trafficking measures adopted in the country. I would like to thank the government for the openness and cooperation demonstrated throughout this mission, which enabled me to gather first-hand information regarding the current legislative framework and institutional programs in place to tackle the phenomenon of human trafficking. I also thank the representatives of the various civil society organizations for their valuable contribution, and the victims themselves whom I met in the shelters that I visited. During this mission, in addition to Manila, I also traveled to Cebu and Zamboanga. I met with His Excellency, the Vice President, the Honorable Secretaries, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, the Department of Justice, including the Undersecretary of Department of Justice, officials from the Department of Justice, Social Welfare Development, Labor and Employment, as well as other members of the Interagency Council Against Trafficking in Persons, including the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, Overseas Workers Welfare Association, Bureau of Immigration, National Bureau of Investigation, MCIA Task Force, and Cebu RIACAT officers, as well as the sea-based anti-trafficking task force and the newly autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao Armed Council Against Trafficking in Persons in Zamboanga. Additionally, I had the opportunity to meet with the Philippine Commission on Human Rights, the Director of ARMM, the Commission on Human Rights, as well as civil society organizations in Manila, Cebu, and Zamboanga. Human trafficking, as you know, is one of the fastest growing criminal activity, coming third after arms and drugs, and making millions of women, children, and men its victims all over the world, as it knows no border. Almost every country of the world is either affected as a source, transit, or destination country. For women and children who are victims of trafficking, they are victims of sexual, labor, exploitation, trafficking for domestic servitude, and bonded labor. Trafficking occurs within and across national borders. often with one consignment of people crossing several borders to reach their final destination. The Philippines is undoubtedly a source country for human trafficking, with its citizens being trafficked in different parts of the world, mainly owing to the socioeconomic conditions prevailing in different parts of the country, including growing poverty, youth unemployment, gender inequalities, discrimination, gender-based violence, especially of women and girls. There is also the issue of cultural and social frameworks that all work to increase particular women and girls' vulnerability to trafficking. In addition, armed conflict, clan feuding, as well as natural disaster cause large numbers of persons to be displaced. And this further adds to the affected community's vulnerability to human trafficking. These socioeconomic conditions have thus been the root causes of the complex, dynamic, and huge underestimated internal trafficking from one part of Philippines to the other, mostly from rural to urban areas. Furthermore, the prevalence of undocumented persons in certain parts of the country increased their vulnerability to trafficking. Children, women, and men are therefore trafficked in the Philippines and abroad for the purpose of sexual exploitation, including sexual tourism, cyber sex, and for pornographic purposes, for forced and bonded labor, domestic servitude, forced marriages, as well as for organ transplantation. Furthermore, trafficking of migrant workers is chiefly due to poverty and unequal access to employment and means of livelihood for women. Women want to migrate to earn income or run away from gender-based violence at home country. Sometimes their migration is facilitated by family members who want to exploit their sexuality or their labor to make money for the family. In recognition of the growing scale and repercussions of trafficking in persons, the government of Philippines has demonstrated strong commitment to combating this scourge. This is reflected by the ratification of the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, otherwise called Palermo Protocol. The Philippine government has also ratified the most relevant core human rights instrument, including the Slavery Convention, the Convention on Protection of all Migrant Workers and their Families, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its Protocol, and then importantly, the 2011 ILO Convention 189 concerning decent work for domestic workers. In particular, the important role that the government of Philippines played at international level towards adoption of this convention. The government has already made significant progress in efforts to address trafficking in persons, particularly since the enactment in 2003 of the Republic Act number 9208, also known as the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act. Additionally, the establishment of IACAT, which provides a forum for different government and department and stakeholders, including civil society organizations, to come together to coordinate and monitor the implementation of anti-trafficking and to discuss various policies and practices to combat trafficking in persons is indeed commendable. Enormous efforts have also been made in the creation of the regional and provincial councils against trafficking in persons and various task forces at the airport, sea base, and land base to enforce anti-trafficking law at regional level. I met with a number of task forces, and the commitment with which their members deploy efforts to fight trafficking is indeed encouraging. The government anti-trafficking initiative is therefore in line with its anti-trafficking law, which indeed encompasses the definition of trafficking in person as provided under the Palermo Protocol and penalizes all forms of trafficking in persons. I welcome the amendment proposed to this law, as well as the revision of the Anti-Money Laundering Act of the Philippines to now include trafficking in persons as a predicate offense for the forfeiture of perpetrators' assets, and for providing that such asset forfeited must go to the trust fund managed by ICAT for the benefit of trafficked persons. I welcome the agreement between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the autonomous region in the Muslim Mindanao as a positive development, which will also reduce vulnerability of persons in the region to human trafficking. I commend the government for its cooperation with countries in the region to combat trafficking phenomena, particularly in the context of ASEAN, that is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and within the framework of the Bali process on people smuggling. Trafficking in persons and related transnational crime. The Philippines also entered into bilateral agreements with numerous countries, and they are cooperating also in terms of for conducting training and capacity building activities. However, despite this positive step, which I have noted, a number of challenges that must be addressed by the Philippine government if it is to succeed in effectively combating trafficking in persons and protecting the human rights of trafficked persons. I identified a number of issues of concern. First is that many of the agencies involved in the anti-trafficking are collecting data on trafficking cases, which is good, but there is lack of standardized collection of statistical information to effectively determine the prevalence rate, forms, trends, and manifestation of trafficking in person. Data collected is therefore confusing and conflicting sometimes as you move from one agency to the other. The lack of accurate data and somewhat low level of awareness, knowledge, and skills among some government authorities to identify cases of trafficking in person prevents that all forms and manifestation of trafficking in persons are duly prosecuted and punished. This also explains the focus of programs and policies of the government on combating internal trafficking for sexual exploitation. Indeed, to date, there have been only 2 convictions relating to trafficking for labor exploitation, despite that specialized units and prosecutors investigate and prosecute cases of trafficking in persons. Furthermore, labor inspectors appear not to have the necessary capacity for effective oversight. There have been efforts to replicate the programs and policies for the implementation of the anti-trafficking law at regional and local levels. However, the current structure contains layered and differentiated levels of implementation, whereby different mechanisms for enforcement of the law at national and regional fall under the jurisdiction of different ministries and under the jurisdiction of the local government when it comes to the provincial level. Hence, enforcement of the law and assistance to victims is not uniform in all areas of the country and depends on the political will of the local government. The government and its partners, including civil society, are making efforts to build capacity of government officials, especially law enforcement agents, on how to handle cases of trafficking in person. However, the large turnover rate of officers hamper the prevention and prosecution of trafficking cases. Although adequate legislation is in place and is being reviewed periodically to be in line with international standards, sexual exploitation of children, especially girls, including for sex tourism, is extremely common, socially and culturally tolerated. The advent of new technologies and the internet is also contributing to new trends of trafficking in children for the purposes of cyber sex and pornography. This is occurring particularly amongst the most excluded sectors of the population, who resort to prostitution, even child prostitution, as a way to overcome their economic situation. Movement or operation of traffickers is clandestine, which makes detection difficult. However, when communities and families are involved in the human trafficking chain, as found in many cases in the Philippines, it makes the situation far more complex. The government is making huge effort to assist its citizens abroad who are trafficked and become irregular migrants, frequently exploited and facing serious violations of their human rights. However, root causes of trafficking, particularly poverty and demands for cheap and exploitative labor, are not being effectively addressed. This has perpetuated the abuse of human rights of Filipinos abroad as well as in the country, who are exposed to exploitation and extortion by brokers, employers, and the law enforcement agents. The irregular migration status of many migrant domestic workers makes them more vulnerable to abuse, including sexual abuse. Filipino migrant domestic workers suffer double discrimination, not only because they belong to a group with low status in society, but also because they are non-nationals in countries of destination where they are working. They are held in domestic servitude and forced labor. Given the scale of trafficking of Filipinos, both internally and across border, the rate of prosecution of trafficking cases remains low, which contributes to impunity of traffickers engaging in illicit and clandestine operations and recruitment. The impunity with which human trafficking is carried out in the country and the horrendous abuses meted out to victims are indeed alarming. Victims are hidden in the community and the unregulated sectors of the economy, engaged in particular with sex work, domestic work, agricultural labor, including sugarcane plantations. Although the law makes provision for witness protection, insufficient resources are available to effectively protect witnesses, leading to very few cases in which victims of trafficking have availed themselves of the government witness protection program. Assistance provided by the Department of Social Welfare Development to victims remains weak, and support to civil society organizations who complement the services provided to the victims of government is lacking. They lack separate government-run shelters and services for victims of trafficking, as well as the inadequate medical, psychological, and legal services, and the right to effective remedies of victims. There is also lack of dedicated shelter facilities for men who are victims of trafficking, because we recognize that men as well as women are victims of human trafficking. In view of the above concerns and observations, which are very preliminary in nature, I've come up with a set of recommendations for the government. The first is that government should carry out an in-depth research on the subject. Additionally, it should develop tools and build capacity for systematic data collection, working in cooperation with United Nations agencies, and they will strive to encourage the systematic collection of data disaggregated by gender, by age, gender, and other demographic information on trafficking in persons and related subjects. There is need to design human trafficking interventions on the basis of accurate data and evidence, as well as to closely monitor and evaluate their impact and effectiveness. Widespread campaigns should be launched to raise public awareness on this issue using media, information technology, and other channels of communication that especially appeals to young ones, in order to send a strong message against the cultural acceptance of both human trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. Government prevention strategies must also address demand as a root cause and ensure that its interventions address the factors that increase vulnerability to trafficking, including inequality, poverty, and all forms of discrimination and prejudice. The structure of the mechanisms addressing trafficking should be revised and harmonized at all levels, and the role of IACAT strengthened as a national agency to coordinate government institutions at all levels. In addition, the government should consider appointing a national rapporteur tasked with the mandate to coordinate all trafficking initiatives. In addition to government current comprehensive training being provided to consular officials around the world, the government should extend such training to police, judiciary, prosecutors, immigration, and labor inspectors. The judiciary should establish or designate specialized courts to fast-track the trial of trafficking cases. Further, it should ensure adequate mechanisms for witness protection and access to justice for victims, their families, civil society actors who might be assisting them. The government should scale up prevention initiatives that will also address the root causes of trafficking in persons, including demand for sexual services, for cheap labor. Importantly, the government should create alternatives, employment, educational, and training opportunities for livelihood sustainability. The government should aggressively address the demand side of trafficking and sexual exploitation, especially of minors in Philippines. The Ministry of Tourism should monitor compliance by hotels, agencies, and other tourist operators, and the agreements it has signed with them regarding the prohibition of child sex tourism. It should also include the businesses in developing appropriate response. Currently, the Filipino borders are too porous and may encourage traffickers and other organized criminals. Therefore, the government should strengthen its border control using new technologies to aid efforts at combating trafficking. Direct assistance to victims of trafficking requires resources, and where the government is not providing such services, which include shelter, compensation to victims, it should at least fund the non-governmental organization that provides such services. Overall, adequate resources is needed in order to combat, enhance effectiveness, and to sustain anti-trafficking initiatives of the government. While promoting safe migration, the government must protect the rights and freedom of men and women and avoid especially stereotyping of female migrant workers. The referral mechanism needs to be strengthened and properly understood by stakeholders, including law enforcement and the civil society organization involved in the government anti-trafficking efforts. The government should strengthen the law enforcement efforts and restructure the anti-human trafficking division of Philippine National Police to promote professionalism, motivation, and incentives for career development. The government should continue to promote the current zero tolerance on corruption and complicity of public officials, so that it does not dilute its efforts at combating trafficking. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, trafficking in person is a dynamic process. It's caused by an array of complex and intertwined push and pull factors. Thus, the prevention of trafficking in persons requires truly concerted and collaborative efforts by all stakeholders, including the private sector. In my view, measures to prevent trafficking will not be effective or sustainable unless the underlying social, economic, and political factors that create an environment conducive to trafficking are addressed. Consequently, strategies aimed at preventing trafficking in person must address the underlying factors that render people vulnerable to trafficking, such as poverty, lack of employment opportunities, sex discrimination and inequality, war and conflict. The root causes of trafficking and migration overlap to a great extent. It is thus important to understand the motivation behind people's decision to leave their homes